full bio and everything because I know you've all been studying up on Jason and his work. But I will say that in addition to being an artist, he's also a curator and activist, and most importantly for this evening, an educator. He teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago as well as Columbia College in Chicago. So I guess I'll pretty much hand it over to him, and then if you have questions for either of us, we'll be around for a little while before you go into the Lobel tour for the second half of the evening. Yeah, I don't want to say too much because I know you all pretty familiar with this show. Just briefly say that I think a lot of his work is kind of touching on the expanded idea of photography and what that means today. He's working with different media, but referring back to photography, as well as looking at kind of the archives through this project, Live Archive, and the Too Hard to Keep project, as well as the process of learning, and in particular kind of the tension between public and private. So Jason will talk to you about the individual works. One thing I wanted to point out just right at the beginning is you might have noticed on the title wall there's the glow-in-the-dark tape, which I think on your floor plan was placed somewhere else, but once Jason saw this kind of darker wall, we realized that would be a really good place for it. So that is actually probably the first work in the show. It's right on the title wall. The label will be right there. So Jason, do you want to?
Yeah, I apologize. I'm going to sit for the beginning part of this because my legs are feeling very creaky. So yeah, the glow-in-the-dark X is taken directly from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So on the last day of the color analog darkroom, I took this tape down, and this tape is up on the wall to help people navigate their way into and out of the darkroom. And so I kind of first see it as a, sentimental, small piece of material that was not only at a darkroom that I've worked at and taught in, but also for a chapter in photo history that came to a close in my workplace. And so for me, I liked that it was sort of a cross-section of all these things. And as Jean said, having the X I thought was so nice, right, on the black paint, because that it evokes how it might have looked in the darkroom. And also, lastly, and these are things you'll maybe pick up on in the work, is I'm really interested in layers, literally and metaphorically. So I see that the darkroom X also sort of doubling as an asterisk, and the asterisk is sort of pointing or winking at you when you walk in that photography marches forward and the technology is changing alongside everything else as time marches on. The Phase 1 projects here with the Occupy signs.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
How do you transport it, and where does it live when it's not on the wall?
It was in a little envelope, and there were there's 8 pieces of tape, 4 X's, so the other 3 X's are in my studio in Chicago.
Are they just in a folder in a filing cabinet?
No, I actually have 2 of them up in my studio wall right now, and every time I turn out the lights, sometimes I forget, but when I turn out the lights, these X's that have been charging all day just flash really brightly, and so every time I turn out the lights and I'm leaving, I'm always a little bit startled if I'm not thinking about it actively. So this project is called Phase 1 Live Archive, And phase one refers to, there are these two activists and who initiated the Occupy movement, who lead this magazine called Adbusters, and in one of their sort of texts that they wrote about Occupy, they called the tactics of bodies in space and signage as phase one in a multi-phase process to initiating some kind of like paradigmatic changes, right? And you know, so I don't really know what phase 2, 3 are for in, but when I read that, I was like, oh, well, the signs are this sort of hallmark of what they called phase 1. And that, to me, seemed like a nice, elusive title. And so, when I initiated this project in September of 2011, I was really interested in the signs, like a lot of people. And I was teaching in Tampa at the time as a visiting artist. It occurred to me that one way to collect the signs was to just remake them. Otherwise, I would have to start to try to, I don't know, go to occupations with an eye toward squirreling away the signs, which seemed kind of counter to what the movement was about. And so I was like, oh, well, I can just recreate these. So I started recreating them in my studio at the University of South Florida. And I remember, like, I had this particularly great student, and he offered to show me, like, I think we went to dinner or something. And at the end of dinner, I asked him, like, hey, I'm thinking of this new project. Can I hire you to work in my studio? And, you know, he was really excited about the idea. So we started, and his name is John. He'll come up later because he also helped initiate the piano piece. So anyway, so I started recreating these with him, and then started to organize these weekly sign-making sessions where on Thursday nights, if students wanted to come by and get free pizza and sort of hang out, that there are all these sign materials and that they were welcome to help to recreate these signs. And so by recreating the signs, I started to realize, like, not only can I make a physical manifestation of all these signs that I don't have access to, but the process of people picking out a sign and making them started to become full of meaning itself. And then people would start to react to certain political messages, maybe use of humor or wit or a particular like sub-argument or need in Occupy that they related to. And some of these are, you know, kind of particularly painterly compared to other ones. So some students, I think, really liked the fact that they could really reproduce like things really well. For example, there's an Occupy apple pie, and I certainly couldn't make that sign. This young woman was able to like recreate that in like 20 minutes. And I think all of this has to do with my kind of continued, maybe belief in like the artists in contemporary times, not as this like unique person, like gifted with special talents, as much as somebody who is maybe like more of an organizer and an editor. I think in contemporary times that those roles are becoming really more important, and it's I'm like I don't really believe in that more traditional sort of notion of the artist. So to that point, there have been other projects in the art world that have recreated you know, paintings or political things. But what I think is really interesting is that when I involved the public, like it was that multiplicity of talents that allow these signs to actually look just like the multiplicity of voices in the real event. And it didn't require like highly trained visual artists across the board. So like a lot of the workshops have just members of the public coming in, and people who don't have any painterly training are sometimes the people I need to match a certain kind of sign. And like that skill, sort of like a kind of crowd sharing mentality. And I think the curator in Chicago, who I worked with on the first chapter of the show, was really responded to the fact that the workshops keep going, the project can grow, even though Occupy is like arguably not going on anymore. And so kind of filling out the physical remanifestation of these signs could happen for the next few years. And lastly, I kind of consider this very much a photographic project in that these images start as media images, they start as JPEGs, and the transformation happens slowly, where they go from like a compressed 2D image file to a living, breathing, three-dimensional sculpture. And that to me is very much where I come from. Like I'm interested in like the photographic, but when I think about that term, I think of it on a much bigger level. So to me, this is like very much also a photography-related conversation, even though for other people it's installation or sculpture. Okay, so yes.
Were these signs made, the ones in Florida, or were some of them from Chicago?
These are made Chicago and Tampa.
Okay.
Yeah.
And were these supposed to be replicas per se?
Yes, yes. All of them are based off of a real sign that was like operated in real time in space somewhere.
And there's nothing that was computer generated, but there must have been some Occupy signs that people printed off.
Yeah, I think like anything that people might have liked, for example, gone to Kinko's was something I was less interested in,
Okay.
because I think it was like also the hand that I was really interested in. And when I see, to me, when people were like, well, what are your list of demands? These are the list of demands, and it's like it's a crazy, disparate, earnest, desperate, like, and profound list of demands and wishes, you know. And I feel like these are a lot of the sentiments that most of the time get subsumed by bigger media circles and larger voices, you know, and these voices get drowned out.
So just to clarify, your selection of the handmade signs is very deliberate.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
the archive that I, you know, like I have a bunch of images that I've collected, and when we Google, I'm looking for things that are handmade.
Got it.
Because I think like in the majority of signs that you do see are handmade, and they kind of belong to an economy of protest. Like we want to get our message out cheaply. The more time we spend on something, the more it costs. Although it might get, if you have a big sign, like I don't know, something that is particularly evocative or grand, you spend more time making it, so that's like less time on the street. So there's a different kind of like economy in protest signage making, which is also about speed and utility. Yeah.
You said you had a different approach to photography. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think maybe the best way to continue that conversation is like I'll try to add to that thread as we go through, because I think that will somewhat naturally, and then we can talk about it at the end.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anyone who has seen these signs in their original context ever reach out to you, having seen?
No, but I found people online where I saw a picture of them and it was like so-and-so, and I found them on Facebook, and I'm like, hey, your sign's in this archive. And so I found one person so far.
What was their signs like?
Oh, they were like, oh, that's great, you know, very, very casual, you know. So original people. But you know, the project I think will hopefully be reaching more of an audience over the next like 20 or 30 years. And I think this project will age in a really interesting way. Because I think Occupy is still like in this sort of historical blind spot. Like it's kind of old news. It happened a couple years ago. And a lot of things, if there's not like a significant amount of action on them, but there's not major changes in kind of the cast of characters or the narrative, then like Guantanamo Bay, it just sort of like just sits there. It's kind of like it sits in a historical blind spot. That's my term for it, and we'll talk about that because there's an image on the other side of this wall. Maybe we'll just do that next. That might be a good connection. And then I'll get this other stuff too. So, so this is, I've been working with these images that are technically after images. So they're photographs that are reversed tonally and also in terms of color. And so what happens optically is if you look at an image whose color or tone or tones have been reversed, if you stare at it for a while in good light and then you shut your eyes, you're able to kind of actually conjure the image up as it actually looks. And there was something about that phenomenon that feels very right to me, which is to say a few things. Like number one, it reminds us that our vision in a way is sort of hardwired. And by being hardwired, we react to certain things consistently, like, you know, certain relationships between colors, focus. You know, there are certain things that are always going to grab our eyes that we take for granted. And I think understanding or thinking about the way that we are engineered to see is also metaphorically nice when thinking about sort of like the challenges that we face and our ability to look at ourselves and what's really happening. So it's sort of like this, in a way, this like, not a congenital birth defect, but a congenital engineering, you know, that I think,
The science of vision.
what?
We talk about the science of it.
Yeah. No. So this is an image of Guantanamo Bay that I found and appropriated. And so technically, if you stare at this thing long enough and then shut your eyes, you are able to conjure a sort of positive, right? Because you're staring at the negative. Now, that being said, this particular image doesn't really work well as an after image because the tonality, like the best kind of images are sort of journalistic images, images that are very contrasty and black and white are very effective images. And with the Guantanamo Bay image, when you stare at it and shut your eyes after a period of time, you may see the like kind of lush foliage in the foreground, which should like appear like in a kind of greenish hue. But because this image doesn't work very well because there's like a lot of tonality as opposed to a lot of contrast, you actually just see sort of what's more or less a black landscape and a dark blue sky, and without any details. And I thought that sort of lack of information that you're able, or that I was able to conjure from an after image was sort of analogous to Guantanamo Bay existing in a sort of historical blind spot. Yeah.
Isn't it almost, it's like the message is that we should be seeing the opposite, that Guantanamo Bay should be the opposite of what it is. It's like a political statement.
Yeah, it is a political piece, and it also, if any, like, there's this famous photographer who I'm sure a number of you guys have heard of, Ansel Adams, has a famous,
California.
yeah, he has a famous photograph called Moon over Hernandez, And actually this photograph is like strangely evocative of that. So I actually like that doubling, that it kind of references a famous, well manipulated image, because he was very good at like kind of this sort of emotional printing and exaggerating skies and giving them sort of dynamic tonal content that would kind of evoke an emotional reaction. Yeah. And then this image over here, Family of Man. It's sort of another sort of photo historical image. So I'm just gonna super quickly read this jacket because the text is it's very ambitious and evocative of the mid-50s and the way that photography was viewed. I believe the Family Man exhibition, produced and shown first at the MoMA in New York and now being circulated throughout the world, is the most ambitious and challenging project photography has ever attempted. The exhibition, now permanently presented on the pages of this book, demonstrates that the art of photography is a dynamic process of giving form to ideas and of explaining man to man. It was conceived as a mirror of the universal elements and emotions in the everydayness of life, as a mirror of the essential oneness of mankind throughout the world. So the thesis of this project was very ambitious and optimistic in terms of imagery being a sort of universal language that had a sort of progressive potential. And actually, if you know, one response to this exhibition was Robert Frank's The Americans, which is a much darker and idiosyncratic view of the country. And you know, if you're curious about it, just Google it and look it up. It's like kind of like the flip side of the coin. And so for me, I was really interested in catalogs from this exhibition because the catalog has also been circulated insanely. And there's tons of copies online. So I started buying used copies that I was hoping would have different kind of writing or wear and tear inside that I thought make interesting fodder for a piece. And I found this one, which I won't read, but I just think it's very interesting the way that Leslie talks to Chris about what the book means to her. And it's so earnest and sincere, and kind of has like a kind of relays an epic responsibility on the book as this like kind of way of recalibrating ourselves into the like harmonious relationship of all being together. And then it's funny because this afternote she writes, you know, sorry, this book has a couple of pages missing, which is also kind of this great denigration of vision, or like, you know, the way things aren't taken care of, and the way that this exhibition has been sort of distilled into this catalog. And as the catalog moves into the world, it ages and then, you know, like even loses pages. And so there's a lot of things that I think are sort of a counter to that initial sort of optimistic vision of photography. And I also like the way that the thesis of this book, that sort of like photography is this universal language, would be such a nice thing to hang next to the Phase 1 archive, where images, again, are still sort of educating us and misleading us at the same time. So, like, imagery is this sort of like sugar that we're always like so desirous of, and that has certain like effects of like generating certain kinds of knowledge, but it's also this slippery slope because it's always pulling us away from other histories and other narratives, and of course what's outside the frame is just as important and what's in the frame in terms of the complete story, blah, blah, blah. Next, this is a piece from a couple years ago. I was in New Orleans, and there was a junk shop that I think was in the upper 9th Ward in New Orleans, and the junk shop had this board of largely African-American family snapshots, and they were all pinned to this board, and I asked the store manager about it, and the manager told me that that they would sell the images, but what they had been doing for the last period of time was they would rent this board to different media production companies who came through town. So if they have a scene or multiple scenes set in New Orleans, typically the crew will go out and look for other things to kind of complete the sets. And so this board of photos was something that had actually been rented multiple times, which I thought was super fascinating. And so I offered to buy the board, and the board of photos, and we negotiated. So when he sold it to me, I asked if he could wrap it with something. Like I asked him if he had a sheet that he could wrap it in, because they didn't have bags. And so he just grabbed this blanket and wrapped it with this black tape. And so after having it in my car for a couple days and thinking about it, I decided that, to me, I wanted to present the piece as like it was given to me, and a sort of essentially retiring these photos from being rented anymore and becoming sort of more of an icon of all of the photos and lives that have been sort of displaced with that event and the mismanage of the aftermath. These two floor sculptures are sort of like a new sculptural series that I've been working on. And these are basically when somebody dies, and sometimes in tombstones, as you know, they'll have a birth date and a death date, and they'll have a dash in between it. And so I saw this movie director, Werner Herzog, give a lecture about his work in Florida, and he talked about the dash as being the most distilled form of the way that someone lived their life. And I thought, oh, maybe that's such a great subject for a photo series, but then I was thinking, how could I complicate that? So I decided to make little physical casts of the dash themselves, and then I end up with a positive, and the positives are, at least so far, anywhere from 1 to 3 inches. And then I take them to this stone carver that I found in the suburbs of Chicago, who's been doing stone carving for 35 years. He actually, Google is one of his clients, and what I do is I ask him, I bring him the little positives, and this one, for example, was 3 inches, and I knew I wanted the lengths to be, at least the first one, to be sort of, I don't know, kind of bodily, or have some kind of relationship of, this one's about 5 feet, and so I wanted it to almost evoke the length of a body. And so this dash I made for the Chicago version of the show, and this was made from the tombstone of Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who was the first African American to successfully have a successful open heart surgery, and the guy that he did surgery on, who had suffered from chest trauma, lived another 20 years. this particular, Dr. Daniel Williams also created hospitals in Chicago and then Pittsburgh that would serve African Americans and other minorities, and also allow them to be, staff and doctors themselves. So he was a big proponent and pioneer of sort of the racially open hospital. Now, he was there was a double reason why I thought he was such a good subject for the first dash, because when someone does open heart surgery on you and gives you 20 years more of life, you have to decide how to live your life. And I kind of think about, on a philosophical level, we all we don't really ask for this life, we just sort of show up and we have to figure out meaning for it. And so, to me, it was this really nice idea that Williams's contribution was to give us more time that we then had to, and that time would tell us more about the way that we chose to live our life and what kind of life would we lead. The other dash is George Moscone, who you guys probably know more, or have known more deeply about him for longer than I have, but I thought he was, especially for someone outside of San Francisco, because this piece was birthed here, but will, travel widely, I hope. And went into have a manifestation of George Moscone's contribution to equal justice, and that I think a lot of people outside of San Francisco might have less familiarity with his assassination and the Milk assassination. And so I would hope to do over the next number of years a whole selection of these, maybe 20, maybe 50, maybe 100, and where the subjects of which would range from people who are sort of maybe not so canonized historically. I mean, Moscone here is a very known figure. My hotel room looks out to the Moscone Center. But I was thinking about sort of making this alternative collection of certain kinds of figures who I think by looking at their lives are really ripe to this question of how do we live our lives and how do we create meaning. The canary photo right over here.
Jason, can I just interject for a
Yes.
second? We have maybe about 10 more minutes
Go
with
faster.
you before we have to go to
Yeah.
Frog and Toad, but I want to make sure that there's time for questions
Yeah.
too.
Okay.
So I don't want to, I hate to rush
No,
you,
no, no,
but
no,
I want to make sure that,
because I just blah, blah, blah. Go on. The canary photo I made in Tampa, and canaries, great symbol of, or the adage, a canary in a coal mine, canaries are very sensitive to air quality, and I made this during the fall of 2011. So this is my other piece that's sort of about Occupy, but people don't have to make that connection. I mean, I just wanted to use this sort of symbol as a way to create a sort of document of a performance, if you will. And so I think that one is better left not talked about very much anyway, so that's good.
okay. Yeah, and if there are specific pieces that absolutely you think should be a part of a tour, don't miss this.
Okay.
Definitely to help
Okay.
us.
This photo, this is, okay, what's really interesting about this is a letter I found in Vienna in a box of sort of B-grade European celebrities with all these signed headshots. And so weirdly, I found this form letter, which is a denial for a headshot, from Neil Armstrong's secretary to someone requesting a headshot, and I thought that this letter was such an interesting sort of bookend to the achievement of walking on the moon, and that this sort of kind of sad form letter was the end of this era. When you think about it, the autographed headshot or picture is a hallmark sort of way that people used to approach celebrities or people with great achievement. And so it's not only was a bookend to the Neil Armstrong chapter in some ways to me, but also kind of marking this time of a signed headshot as like a phenomenon with celebrity and kind of connection to interested fans. And also, so his secretary signed it, and I just didn't want to scan it and print it. I wanted to like put myself into the piece a little bit more. So what I did is I studied and learned her signature, and then I photoshopped it out of the scan that I made, and then I hand signed it myself. Just as a way of creating something that was less of a like giant Xerox and more something where I would have to perform her role of signing off this message, which is just something for me to become more engaged with this conversation I'm having. It's maybe something a lot of people won't notice.
How come there's no date on it? That's just the way it was, no date.
Yeah.
Right. Which makes it interesting.
If somebody asks what was the date,
I can only tell them that I found it in 2008 in Vienna. And maybe I'll just like quickly address this corner. Actually, this piece is really complicated, so I'm just going to tell you guys one thing about it that you can read this on at your own leisure. But the way that I expose these, so that this is again a piece I made on the last day of the color darkroom, and I found some black and white paper that had been abandoned, and I just sort of wanted to get a record of the light coming down that day. And so what I did is I had each of these sheets, and usually when you're printing at an enlarger, the light is fixed and it's coming down and you have a work area, so you set your piece of paper down and then you hit a button with a timer and the light comes down and then it goes off and then you can take it away and put it into the developer tray. But the way that I was holding the paper for this is I was like holding it up like this, and then like let's say this is a bulb right here, I was just sort of holding it up by my fingertips. So that's what you see, like on some of these you can see my fingers holding it. And I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just like, I want to do a bunch of what I would call like light draws. I just want to like get the light down on paper. And later I kind of understood that this arrangement was nice. There's this sort of nice iteration. It evokes ghosting. I liked having that one in the middle on top because it kind of looks like I'm holding the whole collection, and that kind of came like a way to unify the whole gesture into one moment. So I think that's some stuff that's like harder to infer. These two photos, this is at when I was teaching in Tampa, there were all these leftover paintings from all the waves of first semester painting students that came through, and this is one that I found, and I just loved it. I actually bought like 30 of them at this like student sale for $1 a piece. I was just really thrilled. But to me, this kind of gets at the way vision is constructed and the way we recreate reality. And I like the error in it. And so that originally was about this big. It's about 16 by 20, and I wanted to enlarge it and make it into an icon. This piece is I made in Vienna. This is if you're walking up to this art school, there's these steps, but at the bottom of the steps, flanking left and right, are these like stone signs. So this is the right side, and this is for the Art Academy in Vienna. And this is where Hitler enrolled for painting and was denied twice for being like not talented enough. And the conversations between the Chicago curator and Jean and I were trying to figure out like how do we lay out this show. I thought it was interesting to have like a beginning painting next to this art education, which is so charged with this crazy history. And then last, I'll talk about the piano as like my last thing.
And I'm sure we also want to hear about Too Hard to Keep.
Okay.
So you can have two last things,
okay,
then
okay.
questions. We'll push those.
Too Hard to Keep. I made this project because I I feel like I'm the kind of person who would have images that I would like shield for myself, and that like sometimes like I'd maybe thrown away or hidden from myself because of like having a bad or traumatic experience. And so I thought to myself, what if I start asking people if they have photos that fit this simple question, what are photos that are too hard to keep? And I started to get some submissions from my friends, and then with those submissions I was able to then reach out to other people and say, hey, do you have photos too hard to keep? Here are some examples. I'm not interested in the stories, I just want the images. I feel like the images do all the work for you, or for me. If people want to submit images but they don't want them to publicly be viewable, then I hang them backwards.
Do they tell you that? Do you ask that information? Or do you give that information to people saying if you don't want them to be seen?
Yeah. Like, so there's like a little blog site that I run, and then it's also on my artist website. And every time I show the project, and a lot of the information is above this little deposit box. So if people have images that they want to submit to the project, they could hypothetically take them and drop them in this box. If they had a bigger submission, what?
Yeah, I was just going to say also, we've worked it out with visitor services. If somebody has a big submission that they want to bring in, like an album or something, they can leave it at visitor services and then ship it.
Yeah. So, which is like, this is really helpful for me, because every time I show the project, it's an opportunity to just, especially make people who are not maybe artists, you know, like I already know a lot of artists, like this project is not about artists, like with a capital A. It's like I want to reach out to the public, which I do all the time when I show this, and every press mention. It's a great opportunity to just, anybody who has like this relationship with photography. So I also asked a friend of mine if anything ever should happen to me, if he wouldn't mind running the project for me, because not to be sort of dark, but I thought it's such a personal project that I want someone else to kind of steward it, and with the sort of rules and intention that I set out with it to begin with.
The albums are on top or?
Yeah, those are some extra albums, yeah, like that. Sometimes I show stuff like that on shelves, but when I came in here and I thought, you know, like maybe this is a nice way to activate the architecture, and especially the albums that are around the corner on the top, you can see as soon as you walk into this really big space. So just to start to kind of evoke that something special is happening in here.
Do you select these?
Yeah, so this is a site-specific installation. I picked photos that I think are ripe to activate the space. Again, you see things that are like high and low, like floor, kind of more floor bound or up high. And so again, it's that sort of asterisk footnote relationship. There's a slideshow that's going to be on an automatic timer inside, which is this one great submission I got last year. That's like a road trip that was made across the country. Photos are great. They're like really lovely. And so I'm really excited to have the slideshow, because slideshows have this kind of like heartbeat in a way, and it's a different, like, it's funny how this project sort of brings in different elements of photo history into it too. So I have like I have photos that are like, probably like 80 or 90 years old. Not many. And so yeah, so other questions about this room or sort of keep?
So how do you plan to handle the albums of this which
He said they're going to stay there.
that'll be lying there?
Oh, the tables and everything. I'm just gonna keep installing tomorrow, because like I don't think it's done yet, and it's kind of hard to understand when done has happened. So so the tables will be gone, and all the photos that I didn't select for this exhibition will be filed away and come back with the other one.
I kind of like it as a work with fun.
Yeah, yeah,
Are there,
yeah.
are there photos that you're not going to display because you did?
I didn't want to for some reason. I mean, you had to make those choices about what to
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think like sometimes photos are really obvious, and I think they're less interesting. You know, it might be a couple standing in front of a sign that says love, and I'm just like, oh God, like, not this one, you know, and I'm not, you know, and yes, you are always looking at an edited selection, right? So I try to do selections that to me complicate the themes that are in the project as opposed to kind of clearly illustrate one-to-one. You know, there's a lot of, the images in this project I'm really into are the abstractions and the landscapes because they're so stubborn in terms of refusing what makes them too hard to keep. But I feel like, you know, if you maybe took an epic trip with someone and then you had a falling out, that, you know, a photograph of a landscape could, you know, it makes total sense to me how that could be implicated, right?
Well, what do you want people to take away from this?
You know, to be honest, I think what people get out of submitting to the project is kind of where like a lot of the art is, and the installations are a sort of residue of this project. I think like the art, like I said before, like what is the role of artist? I think the role, like my role as an artist is to say like, hey, this sort of like repository doesn't exist. And I'm gonna make it, and I'm gonna give it these kind of parameters that I think will help it look and feel as complex as it is, and that don't turn it into this some kind of like cute website, but that it's more sort of, that it feels like someone is really actively caring for it. And I want the audience to feel that someone is like cares about these images, you know, that everything feels like laid out, and it's not in this sort of encyclopedic neutral way, but it feels like someone's done this purposefully, maybe for reasons that you don't understand.
I have a quick question. You were explaining the process of this piece, that you went to stone carver and you brought positive, and then I think the conversation changed, but I was just curious how it went from this to what the stone carver was.
Okay, that's a great question. I could have done this with a like digital 3D scanner, which I considered when I was thinking about this project. But then I was thinking like, okay, there's this guy who I found who has this 35-year relationship with this material, and so in a way he becomes this camera. He looks at it, he studies it, he like scans it, and then manifests it. So what we do is essentially we take measurements, right? This thing is like 3 inches by 1/8 of an inch by 1/15 of an inch or whatever, and then we mathematically res those up to like, okay, Jason, what kind of end size do you want? Oh, I want 5 feet long. Okay, that'll mean that it's this high, this wide, blah, blah, blah. And then he just works visually off of the positive. And, you know, he did such a good job with the first one. And he has these like finishing tools. And I kind of, with the first dash, I stopped him short because he was going to pull out these tools to kind of smooth it out a bit. I was like, no, I like it how it is. I like how each hit and chisel into the material is like, I want your hand to be in the piece. So in a way, he's like my scanner and printer of a 3-dimensional space for this project, which is again, like connects to this idea of like, when I think of the photographic as a much larger concept. Does that answer your question? And then I can try to quickly talk about the piano piece. So my star student who was helping me with this project, after I left Florida and then he moved to Philadelphia, he sent me a link to a particular Chopin nocturne rendition on the internet. And so I played it, and the beginning of this piece was, as opposed to being really technically demanding and quick, was very slow, and there was a lot of negative space in the first 5 notes. And it was this very sort of melancholic melody that immediately starts the piece and it repeats a few times. And I was like, God, I love this piece, I don't know why. And then around the same time, I was asked to do what's called a Chicago Work Show at the MCA in Chicago. So it was like kind of a big opportunity for me as like a growing artist to do something, whatever, interesting in front of all my peers, like in a esteemed public forum. So, and I was thinking a lot, I had read this article by one of the professors I teach with called Beyond Face, the Artist as a Public Amateur, which was really, and I can like get a link to that to Jean if you're interested. It's like, it's actually pretty short and very clearly written. And she kind of talks about the kind of possibilities of the artist as this person who can work in between mediums, and that some of their strength is that they're not experts. And by not being experts, sometimes you kind of like come in to a discipline from like a side angle, and you're able to maybe achieve things or look at things in a different way than people who are maybe like steeped deeply into the sort of like normal historical narratives of any given discipline. So anyways, I thought, well, what if I had somebody who could, who was like a talented young player, learn this piece in public? And so I proposed this project. It got accepted by the museum. We went to DePaul, which is where I got my undergrad in marketing, ironically. And I knew they had a good music program, so I proposed the project, and they were into it and referred me to the music school. And then the chair, like a couple more referrals later, and then they were like, Anthony is like the guy you want for this project. And Anthony had this wonderful relationship with the piece. He totally got it when we sat down and had coffee and I explained it to him. He was totally willing to kind of invert his normal artistic process. He understood the benefits that this might relay to a public, to have this like sort of beautiful metaphor unfurling in front of an audience for 12 weeks. And Chopin is a particularly interesting composer because he actually played very softly, and so when he would play in these big halls, he would get panned as being a bad player because no one thought that he wasn't like rising to the size of the venue, so he sort of retreated to the salon and made most of his money off of teaching. And then in a way, he sort of not only used but pioneered the nocturne, which are these short, like 3, 5, 6 minute pieces, to become not just these like training exercises or things that you would do as like kind of a goof off or like a minor gesture, musical gesture, but gave them this very short format a lot of gravity, right? And so that you could kind of participate in making really esteemed, epic musical gesture in a short form, which I also think is very analogous to like contemporary artists, and an exercise I often have my students do, which is making very minimal gestures and asking them, where is the art? Is there any art in this? Because oftentimes students will, if they're good at drawing, they'll just always want to draw because they get addicted to that labor and being successful, but they don't ask themselves like, well, why even do a drawing? And like, how does it serve this subject that you're really interested in? So to me, the piece is very much about being an artist, being an educator, but I think is hopefully metaphorical for, the public at large as, existing within a continuum of learning and progress that's shaky.
And the reason you don't want a tape playing or anything like that with these artists is not actually present?
because I didn't want people to get confused about, well, then whose music is that? You know, we have a recording of the first, we have like some footage of the last time this project was done. But what happened the first time is that people would go, once they learned about the piece, and if they were interested in it, people would like come every week and listen to Anthony. You know, and you know, not a lot of people, but some people, or some people might, you know, have caught him a few times during the exhibition, but maybe not every week or whatever. And so, you know, what's nice is when Paul, the player, isn't here, you know, the piano, the keys are, you know, the piano is shut and it's dormant, just like as we might check in to like work on a research paper or do whatever kind of like labor toward a certain goal. You know, Paul's off doing his other stuff, and that the only music you'll hear is coming from his hands at his current level of grace with the piece.
And to jump in there, so I sent out the schedule of his playing, and we don't know what it's going to be like while you're touring. It's just going to be twice a week. I think it's Tuesdays and whatever I emailed out. So Mondays and Thursdays. So just, I talked to him today, I met him, and just keep me posted how it's going. There's going to be a rug that's going to go under the piano to muffle the sound, but Jean and I tested it in the corner and we could hear each other, but just we can play with the schedule, so just keep me informed, those of you who are touring on those days.
Yeah, and Paul is, he is permitted and encouraged to talk to people. A lot of people will come up to him and they'll just start talking. This happened to Anthony. So Paul's directive is talk to people. You're welcome to talk to people. That's a great part of the piece. If you feel like you're falling behind in your practicing, you know, you can be like, all right, I got to get back to performing and practicing. Yeah.
There was another piece in that room, that's the wall.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so.
Okay, very quickly, instead of having more photos up around it, I wanted to, because I consider the piano player sort of like a metaphor for a lot of things, basically what I did is this past Sunday, I collected 51 articles, news articles, that are anything from little local stories to international news stories, and made sort of like a time capsule. And they opened the wall for me, and I stuffed all those articles into the wall, and then me and one of the preparators kind of like patched it up, but we didn't re-sand it and repaint it because we want people to see that there has been some sort of interruption in the wall. So much like when you have a painting and you have like a figure and then a ground behind the figure, I wanted Anthony, at least in spirit, or I'm sorry, Paul, that much like the piano player, there are also all of these sort of micro and macro narratives that are surrounding us all the time. Right? So we have our personal lives and our own goals, and as we move shakily or strongly through those, there are these political, cultural, historical arcs happening around us on bigger and bigger levels. And so in spirit, Paul plays, and the kind of wall behind him holds some of these stories as sort of like a background for his playing.
Did you like cut from the newspaper?
Oh yeah.
Which papers?
All like everything from like the sort of like dollar paper they sell on the street in San Francisco, street sheet, up to global international newspapers.
So you always do that with recent news?
Well, I did it for this show and for the last show, and you know, that's like a piece that is more symbolic, and it's actually more of like a selfish piece. Like, I get a lot from doing it because I go through, just by selecting stories and thinking of them in a very like much more aerial view, like how is this going to read in 20 or 50 years if anyone were to ever find this little trove of articles.
So when the show is over, are they going to sand it
over and leave.
They'll sand it over and repaint it, and it's like you'll never know that
Stay.
that was there.
Cool,
So
I didn't know
they'll
that.
stay with the institution, which I like, and it's CJM is not a collecting institution, so it's nice to like.
Don't tell anyone we have a
force them to,
collection
like,
now.
Have something in their system, you know.
So let's take a couple of questions, general questions for Jason or specific questions for Jason before we transition to something completely different. Questions?
Do you think that sentimentality has a place in your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was, is there sentimentality in the work? And you know, contemporary art is actually not friendly to, I would say, sentimentality. I feel like music is the best medium to get away with. You can be very emotional and like, I don't know, contemporary art, like it's kind of a taboo for a lot of people. And my goal in my work is for the work to have sentiment, not to be sentimental. And like, that's just one way that I think about what is the fine line between sort of earnestness, directness, kind of like connectivity, without indulging in some sort of like art therapy, over emotional kind of dark spiral of self-pity and over nostalgia for every moment that we have. Any other questions?
Nobody has anything else?
Where do you go?
I have one more question.
Yeah?
Once again, is there some additional message to the Vienna and Hitler's story? I mean, I have my own take on it. I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
If there's something else that you think you want people to get from it. Which one? The Vienna art.
Yeah. Well, I'll answer that question by sidestepping it a little bit, which is to say, like, you guys might have noticed that my photography doesn't look consistent. It's all different sizes. I use different cameras. Sometimes I appropriate. Sometimes the frames are different. I don't really believe, I think the way that I was educated in photography was to make a series, to have a subject that was really focused, dig deep in a certain way, and to like apply an aesthetic and to kind of like pump it out. And I don't think that that way of making images to me it's a bit antiquated and irrelevant for our contemporary culture. And so to me, having these images push and pull you through not only time and space, but visual strategy, subject matter, historical, contemporary, or future. To me, that kind of push and pull is what I'm interested in, because I feel like that's more reflective of sort of the randomness and like the kind of work we have to do to make meaning ourselves.
That was definitely a side step.
I have one.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just wondering what brought you here. Like, this
Right.
kind of work.
Oh, what brought me here?
Yeah, I don't know here.
Okay, so I'm going to try to answer that really fast.
Yes.
So like, as you might have noticed, I was born with a physical disability, which I made work about in grad school, but was not interested in making work post-grad school about that at all. And I think like having that condition growing up, I don't think it like made me an artist, but I think it made me think inwardly a lot and made me really nervous. And I had to like try to figure out how I would get things done that other people took for granted, and like, okay, how am I going to get on top of that? How am I going to like navigate the situation? And so I think that sort of sensitivity and inwardness as a kid were helpful qualities later when I decided to be an artist. I grew up in a conservative Judaic household, and then after my bar mitzvah, I taught other kids their Torah portions, so that was my first job. And so that was maybe the sort of seeds of teaching. And one of my, like, I remember a long time ago, one of my rabbis was like, you should be a rabbi, but I think, like, I'm just a different kind of rabbi. So I felt like it was really nice to be asked to come here because I'm not very much of a practicing Jew as much as, like, I've been Jewish my whole life and had the culture of Judaism around me, and it's been fun and interesting to think about maybe that relationship, because I think I've taken it for granted a long time. And as soon as I talked to Dan Schifrin, who's the Judaic historian here, and he mentioned some kind of parallels, some things that he had thought about, I'm like, wow, you are blowing my mind right now. And that was one of the reasons why I was so excited to do this show here, is because it's kind of an excuse for me to not only have a public, but to kind of understand my work through a Jewish lens that I've kind of not actively thought about for a while. And so to me that's been, again, like I'm like a student now of the work that I've made, because I'm like recalibrating it momentarily to think about, like, well, what is its Jewishness? But I think to me, like, much like I think you learn a lot about an artist that has a disability by them not making work about the disability, but by making work about every other thing in the world. I think you learn about Judaism's role in my work by saying, like, well, this is what a Jew thinks about. And it doesn't have to be like, here's a menorah, here's gefilte fish, or whatever silly things. But it's just like, I think this show is actually really Jewish, the more I think about it. And I could articulate why if someone asked. Please.
You know, it's interesting because this has come up. We always get questions from our visitors.
Yes.
What's Jewish about this? And you know, this is so great.
What's
Lay it
Jewish
on
about
us.
this
And
is that, like,
can someone tell Karen I'm sorry? Can you tell Karen that sorry, we're going to finish up soon. It's
okay,
Jason's fault.
So yeah, totally blame it on me. But, Judaism has Jewishness has such a relationship with trauma and like a complicated history that I kind of feel like our unique gift to give as people is empathy, right? As like a starting point. And I kind of feel like, so for example, how gay marriage has come about recently, and it's being passed by different states, as an example. The people who are going through that struggle right now to kind of have like equal recognition under the law are in a position in the future to be more particularly empathetic and comrades to people who have some future social justice infraction against them. So as you've gone for it, like as you go through those things, then you become particularly sensitive or empathetic or come to the aid or the help of those people. So for me, a willingness to look backwards, I think, is Jewish. A willingness to kind of look at people in need or marginalized, people in need of empathy, like Too Hard to Keep, phase one, but also I think like there's a criticality in this work, which is to like a deep sort of philosophical questioning of what is vision and what is really progress. And I think that I would hope, like for me, the best version of Judaism would ask those questions a lot, you know, which is like what's really happening here. And I think like rabbis have that kind of philosophical presence and kind of, they don't take things for granted in maybe these deep questions, right? So like, what is the role of gender, for example, when intertwined with this sort of deep historical literary text about like who can be a rabbi, right? And so that's sort of like a question like you have to evolve. So those are some of my instincts about the way that I've been thinking about Judaism with this show.
Great. Thank you. And thank you so much for being here and spending
Hey,
so
guys,
much time
this
with
is,
us.
like, I actually like, enjoyed this way more than the press. It's much more interesting for me to answer your questions, and I'm sorry to kind of make the first part of this evening long, because I know you guys are all here. I really appreciate the questions, even if you didn't ask and you're just here. So please, I will be with you for this next 4 months, even though I'm not with you. So thanks.
Thank you.
Stay well.
Thank you.